Thank you for watching the HueMan podcast. If you find this information valuable and beneficial, please like, subscribe, and share.
I'm talking the other day to this sister, and she is just talking about manhood, what it means, what is it.
Right.
Then there's this gray area about masculinity and the whole, and I feel like people are just like struggling with the two.
Yeah, especially since the roles are changing and, we're dealing with, these gender specific things that have started to happen. And I think we should just address that. I think we should talk about
Manhood
it.
versus masculinity.
I think it's we should go there.
Let's go.
Cause we all one human.
All right. Episode 2, Manhood versus Masculinity. Welcome to the HueMan Podcast. I'm Dondre Whitfield.
I'm Antonio Dixon.
This is a subject that I think everybody's going to be on fire about.
Yeah.
Because it causes great confusion and great division.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think people are confused about what the two are.
Right. Especially, you're looking at both genders right now. We're dealing with an issue of gender roles changing and shifting, and times have changed, and a lot of times, what has worked traditionally doesn't necessarily work with modern society. So we've got to figure out and redefine some of these things and some of these roles so that things are a lot more clear cut and they're more identifiable for both. Because a lot of even when you're looking at a lot of the men that I know and I encounter a lot, we're dealing with a lot of identity crisis. We're dealing with trying to figure out, where do I fit in this modern world? And, if I'm dealing with a woman who already makes her own money, who already has her own crib, the things that we used to need traditionally, she doesn't necessarily need anymore. And the messaging that we unfortunately are getting is that we're not needed, and if our identity is based off of tradition, now we're stuck in these, in a job that is no longer required.
While we talk about that, because everything that you're talking about is spot on, I think people are confused about whether these two things are one and the same,
Right.
or two separate issues,
Right.
two separate things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important for us to first tee up the conversation by defining what manhood is and defining what masculinity is.
Right. You look at the definition of masculinity, it talks about the social expectations of being a man. The term masculinity refers to roles, behaviors, and attributes that are considered manly. Whereas, again, you look at manhood, and it's actually the state or period of being a man rather than a child, rather than a boy. So it more speaks to maturity and development, whereas masculinity more speaks to traits and attributes that are more defining of manhood and masculinity.
Yeah, that's one school of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another school of thought where an additional definition of masculinity would be qualities traditionally ascribed to men,
Right.
such as strength and aggressiveness.
Right.
That is a working definition.
Mm-hmm.
And then manhood, going from, what I talked about in my book, Male versus Man, that males look to be served while men look to be of service.
Right.
So if men look to be of service, then manhood is about you dedicating yourself to a life of service.
Right.
So manhood is about the dedication to being of service.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So now we're talking about two completely different things.
Right.
Right? So let's look at it from this angle. If we looked at the NBA draft, say we looked at the NBA draft 20 years ago.
Right.
You look at the way guys dressed during the NBA draft 20 years ago, completely different than the way we see it now.
Right.
If you look at the NBA draft now, you might think that you were looking at at times the WNBA draft,
Right.
because some of the lines of dress are being blurred.
Right. Right.
I've seen brothers wearing bell-bottom, pants and, jackets sort of open, no shirt, sequins, like it looked like a Bob Mackie outfit
Right.
that like who used to,
Right.
back in the day, the designer who did stuff for Carol Burnett and right.
Right.
But now that outfit or fit would not be considered to be traditionally masculine.
Right.
But that same man can be a great man because he's still a great father,
Right.
a great husband, a great asset to the community.
Right.
So we're talking about a being who is walking out great manhood,
Right.
but wearing something that would not be traditionally considered to be masculine.
Right. Right. It's one of those things where you look at the dynamic that social constructs change. So, again, what is considered, and it's a cultural thing as well. So you look in our culture, in the black and brown culture, a lot of what is considered more effeminate, even dress, it's shunned upon in one particular culture, but then you'll go around the world, look at another place where like a skirt is actually very normal for a man. So there's a lot of the cultural dynamic that has to be considered when you're looking at what is considered masculinity versus what's considered manhood. And to your point, someone's outfit or how they choose to express themselves in fashion has nothing to do with necessarily what their behaviors are, what their availability is to service. A lot of the things that they choose to do to be of service to mankind, to women, to other men, whatever. We have to kind of separate the fact that how you choose to express yourself may not necessarily be the exact same thing as your behaviors and your development as a man. They can be completely different things.
Completely different things, because when we also look at, our siblings, because at times, when we're talking about our folks from the LGBTQIA plus community, you say brother or sister, some people don't want to be identified as such.
Right.
So I've said sibling, and no one can argue with that.
Right.
So our siblings from that community, if you take someone who is gay, you take a gay man, he may not necessarily be masculine presenting, but again, can be a great man because he's a great asset to the community,
Right.
maybe a great father, maybe a great husband to his husband. So we're talking about manhood from a space of being dedicated to being of service, but again, not necessarily masculine.
Right.
Now let's flip that on its head. I know a bunch of dudes who are uber masculine,
Right.
and their manhood is trash.
Right.
Right? So they've created a bunch of lives. They've got kids all over the place, abusive toward the women that are in their lives, and do nothing to serve others but serve themselves.
Right.
So now we got to ask ourselves, are we hanging our hat on manhood, or are we hanging our hat on masculinity?
It's a heavy topic because unfortunately because we've not been clear as to the definition of these two terms, the worlds have actually collided. We've majored on the minor. You know what I mean? We've made such a big deal about how someone dresses, maybe how someone speaks, who they choose to love, as an option, as a definition of manhood, and not considering even their origin to even where these attributes came into play, not considering the influences that created a lot of this, their mindset and things like that. And we're looking at it as something that was not developed in regards to understanding what manhood was. Is to your point, like if it's about being of service, again, if I come to you and I'm of service to you, it has nothing to do with how I dress. It has nothing to do with how you present yourself. It's really about the fact that, again, I see someone in need. I'm here to be of service, to make sure that when you've left my presence, you left a better person. That's manhood.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talked about being present or being available when someone is in need.
Right.
We've seen instances all over social media where our women are left in lack when we don't show up or we don't perform in key situations.
Right.
So let's take, for example, the unfortunate situation that happened in Chicago in a restaurant. A brother assaults a sister in the restaurant. Her 14-year-old son comes, has gun in hand, shoots this brother and kills him.
Right.
Manhood and masculinity both played a role in that incident.
Right.
A lack of manhood from the brother who assaults the sister. Uber masculine as he is aggressive.
Right.
Because remember, I talked about qualities traditionally ascribed to men, such as strength and aggressiveness. Uber aggressive. So now we're talking about uber masculine.
Right.
But this is the masculinity that we talk about being of the toxic nature. Right? So now, fast forward to 14-year-old boy comes in with said gun, shoots this brother, another masculine trait, right? The first brother lacking manhood, but possessing uber toxic masculinity. 14-year-old boy also now presents great manhood because he's there to protect his mother.
Right.
He's there to be of service. Also displaying great masculinity, uber masculinity. Why? Strength and aggressiveness.
Right. I completely agree. And I think on top of that, I think where we also have to grow in our development as men is understanding that all of our wiring, like to your point, aggressiveness, it's necessary, but it's knowing when to apply it. So there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is the attaining of information, but wisdom is knowing when to apply it, right?
Absolutely.
So again, if you understand, and I know I've mentioned this before, when you understand why we're wired the way we are, it's not that it's toxic. It's only toxic when it's used and it's in an appropriate context. So aggressiveness is definitely necessary in certain cases. You know, to your point, if it's about protection, aggressiveness is necessary. Now, if it's abuse, then now you've, again, applied your aggression in a toxic nature. So that's where I think we've had to deal with misunderstanding about our development as men is that, again, not being put in a situation where we've applied the information that we have or applied the resources that have been put in us, the wiring that has been put in us, and not knowing when to apply it at the proper time. It's put us in a dangerous situation. It literally is deadly. We have to make sure that we are wise when it comes to understanding our wiring and knowing when to apply it, you know?
When you're talking about the application of anything, most things in life are necessary in a particular space.
Right.
Most things in life.
Right.
Now, of course, there are always going to be people who, what I call the contrarians, right? No matter what you say, that person is going to have a stance that's contrary to the stance that you have.
Right.
You know, there are a whole bunch of people in our world that don't really have a stance. In lieu of having a real stance, they will say or take the stance that is contrary to the stance that you take.
Right.
To make it appear that they actually are thoughtful and have a stance.
Right.
So there's a saying, time and a place.
Right.
There's a time and a place for most things in life, particularly as we are talking about masculinity. There is a time and a place for masculinity. There's a time and a place for a man to have strength and aggressiveness.
Right.
On the battlefield, that is a time and a place to have strength and aggressiveness.
Right.
When we're playing sports, it's a time and a place for us to assert ourselves and to have strength and aggressiveness, right? In this particular case that we're talking about, that 14-year-old boy had to display strength and aggressiveness.
Right.
There is a professor, I always hesitate, you know, I always say we never attack a person, we address a position. So I'm not going to give this professor's name, but He works at an extremely accredited institution of higher learning in this country. Works as a professor of African American studies, ironically, who said that toxic masculinity is redundant and that it needs to be abolished. It's a ridiculous notion because, again, we're talking about time and a place.
Right.
Masculinity is absolutely necessary when we're talking about those aforementioned situations.
Right.
And is it possible for you to be both sitting in your manhood and have masculinity? Absolutely. Is it necessary for you to be masculine in order for you to walk out manhood? No.
Right.
Those two things can be separate.
Right.
And that's where I think many people have it mixed up.
Yeah. I would submit this. When we're talking about toxic masculinity, who's it toxic to? Because in this situation, we're looking at the 14-year-old young man who now is going to have to live with the scarring of what he did for the rest of his life. This part is never going to really be addressed. I really hope he's getting the help he needs because his masculinity was not toxic to anyone else but himself. And the world is not going to see it that way because, again, they're going to look at it as what he did as protection, which he did. He did what he was supposed to do. Unfortunately, he's going to have to live with the scarring of the fact that he killed a man the rest of his life. He's never going to get that image out of his head. He's never going to be able to completely grasp the pain, and no one else is going to be able to connect with him on that. So it's like, I think we have to look at the fact that when we hear terms like toxic masculinity, I'm always going to argue, okay, well, who's it toxic to? Because again, a lot of the poison that maybe comes out in a symptom of something that's going on in someone, actually is poison to himself. He's already been poisoned to himself. So the toxicity is really within him. And it's something that actually just maybe has been expressed publicly or whatever. But again, you look at these behaviors and these attributes of things that have happened, and you start to realize, well, maybe the toxicity was something that was actually birthed in him or put in him that wasn't necessarily because of a behavior that he did towards someone else. It could be something that was actually imprinted in him. Because I'm sure he woke up that day and had no idea that was going to be how his day ended. He had no plans on having to use that particular part of his undeveloped manhood, honestly. Okay, well, where were the other men in her life? Because why did it have to be this 14-year-old boy that had to be the one to come to her defense in that situation? He, unfortunately, this is something I connect with very well in that, again, being that I had to become the man of my house at such a young age, realizing that he's underdeveloped. He doesn't really understand everything that he had to do. He just knew that his mother needed his help, and the situation was a dangerous situation, and he did exactly what he was told to do.
This is the reason why I don't, and I know you don't either, entertain the question of whether we're equal or not.
Right.
Because many of us are being deactivated because often in our society, we are being told that we're unnecessary.
Yeah.
But as soon as our presence isn't felt,
right,
everyone is asking where we are.
Right.
This is why I don't entertain those conversations. Men are absolutely necessary, not optional.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that, and I'm going to be honest, it pisses me off. It pisses me off that we have to keep having this conversation about whether we are necessary in this society or not.
Right.
You can't keep telling me that we're unnecessary and then keep judging me for not showing up.
Right.
Well, you just told me I'm unnecessary.
Right.
But now you're going to judge me for not coming to your aid or your defense.
Right. Right.
Which one is it?
Right.
We are absolutely necessary as fathers. We are absolutely necessary as leaders of our home. That is not to say that our women are not necessary in leadership Also, but it is absolutely necessary for a man to show up in a leadership position in his home because he has vision for his home. He has strength for his home. He has aggressiveness in appropriate times to protect his home.
Right.
So if we're sitting there and we keep hearing that we're unnecessary, then we say, okay, men absolutely move away from spaces where they feel like they're unnecessary.
Yes.
This is where we need our sisters to hear this loudly and clearly.
Yeah.
Men move away from spaces where they are unneeded. So if you tell a man he isn't necessary or he's not needed, he will leave there.
Yeah. And to add to that, sometimes it's done in a way that is like not necessarily direct, but it can be like, I'm independent. I got my own thing. And I think that's beautiful, especially when you're looking for a partner. You're not looking for someone that you have to baby.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? You're looking for a partner. You're built, like you said, to what you were saying before. If you're building a vision, if you are proing a vision or being a provider, creating provision, you want someone that's going to be there to actually help you support that vision. Now, if I'm in a situation where I'm placed where I feel like my presence isn't necessary, if I'm told that I don't need you, then I'm not going to run to that. But I guarantee you I'm going to run to where I'm celebrated. I'm going to run to those positions or those places where I'm told, wow, look at what you did. I really appreciate that. Again, a simple thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing like that. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of men have been put in a position where they feel like their presence is no longer necessary, but then they run to the places where it is. And then you wonder why they have difficulty with commitment. They have difficulty with, we look at this a lot of times, even in marriages and things like that, where it's like, oh my God, this man walked out on his family and he left his family or he had this other woman or he had this other situation. It's like, well, it's not always as simple as this is a man with no discipline.
Right.
Sometimes it's the way he was, again, it was what was planted in him and also what he craved, which was, again, to be celebrated, to be respected, to be upheld. And he now is in a situation where, like, not to say that it's right. And again, I'm not trying to,
because
I don't want to encourage
that.
that.
So you saying it's okay for him to run out? No,
that's not at all.
What we're saying at all.
No, this is about understanding. To me, this is not even a question of encouraging that behavior, but understanding that, look, when a man is put in a position where he is celebrated and he is honored, where the risks that he takes are rewarded, he is going to do everything in his power to make sure that he supersedes the expectations of those around him. In all areas of life, that's how we work. The reason why cheering works at a game and adds adrenaline, or they say adds energy to a game, is because when we're celebrated for what it is that we've accomplished, we want to make sure that we dig even deeper to do even more. We look at sports, and that's a general analogy, but that works in life too. When we are cheered on, when we're celebrated for the things that we do, we're going to do even more in that situation. We're going to make sure that we overachieve. Mm-hmm. And I think that has to be one of those things that has to be noted about us.
Thank you for joining the HueMan Podcast. You can support us by liking, subscribing, and sharing. First of all, the whole cheering analogy, listen, man, we can all day long until we're blue in the face, we can have people talk about, well, why does a man need to be cheered for him to perform? Well, I don't need that in order for me to perform, but it will help.
No question.
It will absolutely activate me and turn me up all the way to 10. Right. Now, what do you want me to be on? 7, 8, 9, or 10? Just as there are certain things that I give you as a man that makes you feel full as a woman. Mm-hmm. When you walk outside, obviously I'm talking about the women that are in my life, from my wife to my mother to my daughter. If they come, we're about to go someplace, and they come out of the room dressed, looking like their full self, shoes, however they're dressed, the hair, the makeup, the whole thing, the first thing that they will ask you is, how do I look?
Mm-hmm.
Now, they already feel beautiful. They already think they look beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have come out that way.
Right.
The reason why they ask us, how do I look, is because they're looking for affirmation.
Right.
The quickest way to activate anyone is to affirm them.
Right.
If you want men to perform, affirm us.
Right.
You need our manhood. You need our masculinity.
Right.
A man is supposed to be the protector and the provider. Guess what he protects? He's supposed to protect your safety.
Mm-hmm.
He's supposed to provide stability.
Mm-hmm.
The quickest way to get him to be the protector of safety and to be the provider of stability is to affirm what he does when you see him doing it.
There's so much life in the words that are spoken over us, the words that are spoken to us. But to the same degree, and you've heard this before, life and death are in the power of the tongue. But in a lot of ways, you can speak life into a man just by the words you say to him, by the affirmations you put in him. And I say this oftentimes too, for those women who are dealing with young men, or or in a relationship with someone, and they maybe are not showing up in their manhood as well as you would like them to. I always say this: speak the things you want to see in him until you see what you say. Start to speak it into him. Speak life into him. Speak affirmation into him, because trust me, he's going to overachieve. He's going to know what your expectations are, and you're literally teaching him how to treat you by what you say to him. That's one of the key things that I think gets stepped over or missed a lot, is that literally you're teaching a man how to treat you by the words you put in him.
Yes.
So again, if you're teaching him that he is not necessary, if you're teaching him that you can do it better, if you're teaching them that his presence was a nuisance, guess what he's going to do? He's going to react in that way, or he's going to run from it. Because one of the things we do is we run to the things that we're good at.
Yes.
And how are we going to know if we're good at anything if we're not affirmed at what we tried to do? And it's a development. It's one of those things that we're not going to get right every time. We're not going to get it right away.
Yep.
But it is something that can be developed. And the way that you, again, add a battery pack to his back is by affirming him, and start to see if you're not seeing it yet, speak into him what you want to see until you see what you say.
Yeah. It's crazy, because when we examine that situation that we talked about in Chicago, I've had a few sisters say to me, well, what is being a man? What is manhood? What is that? Because this dude or guys like that would tell you that they're being a man. Mm-hmm. They identify mm-hmm. as being a man.
Right.
That's why it's extremely important for us to have clear definitions mm-hmm. as to what everything in life is.
Right.
It's important for all of us to have a clear definition about what manhood is.
Right.
It's important for us to have a clear definition about what masculinity is. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter how he identifies.
Right.
It only matters that you know clearly what the definition of those two things are, right? Because our entire world right now,
right,
that's one of the biggest issues that we have right now, is how people identify. Mm-hmm. I can respect how you identify, but I have to be clear about what I know I'm dealing with.
Right.
So it doesn't make a difference whether you identify as Batman or not.
Right.
If I see you mm-hmm. as a dude who is dressed up as a Marvel comic character,
right,
I have to know that this is what I'm dealing with, which is a person who's dressed up as a Marvel comic character. I can still respect you as you wish to identify, but it's extremely important that I am clear with what I'm dealing with. So whether that dude identifies as a man or not, what matters is that I'm very clear about what a man is. So we need to begin to reimagine what manhood and masculinity is and how important they are for our families and for our communities.
Yeah. Looking at how roles have changed, and you look at the fact that, our parents and grandparents and great grandparents, there was a certain level of masculinity that was identified for that time, that was necessary for that time. You look at the fact that, most traditional families at that time, the man was the one who was the breadwinner, the woman was the one who was the nurturer of the home, and so he was the one who ultimately and literally was risking his life, because we were in the Industrial Revolution and all of these things where the work at that particular time was literally dangerous to his life. He could not come home.
Mm-hmm.
So the level of respect he got from that, going out to that particular danger at that time, was different. And so him partnering with the woman that he had at that particular time, also, it was a necessary partnership in that there was no way he could go out into the world, risk his life, and take care of a home.
Mm-hmm.
And with everything that came with that, her role was definitely necessary at that time too. Fast forward, you're looking at, again, what we said before, you're dealing with a lot of women where you come to the women and the women already have their own homes. They already have their own careers. They don't need you for the same thing that they need you for before. And so I think we've had to look at the redefinition of what that looks like, and say, okay, in this modern era, if both of us come with these with all of these resources, how do we go ahead and we navigate this world and still develop and raise our families and protect our families and nurture the families,
Mm-hmm.
and do all of the things? Because again, it's really about our survival and our being able to flourish. If we don't figure out and come up with the proper definitions, we are going to make our families implode. And this is the reason why we're dealing with such massive numbers of divorce, and we're dealing with,
They're already imploding.
yeah, it's imploding just going in, because we going in and saying, okay, well, we like each other, but we don't really have any clear-cut roles as to what it is we're going to be doing or why we're even partnering.
The clarity about the roles that you're talking about, we're really saying that both men and women obviously now are becoming or have become the breadwinners of the house.
Right.
So we're not solely dependent upon the man to be the breadwinner of the house.
Mm-hmm.
When I talked about earlier that a man is supposed to be the protector and the provider, I have often said, be clear about what we're providing.
Right.
Right? The providing of stability now becomes about mental stability, emotional stability, spiritual stability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The roles of yesteryear, when they said protector, provider, the provider was the man and he was providing finance.
It was limited to money.
It was limited to money.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to provide finance because that's the way I stabilize the home.
Right.
And the woman provided the spiritual stability.
Right.
She was providing the emotional stability,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that was the role. Now that all of these things have shifted, the man is supposed to be the one who says, okay, I got to be more stable mentally. I got to be more stable emotionally, because at times, maybe my wife might be emotional because of the space that she may be in. But biologically, if we're talking about, and we got to get real,
Mm-hmm.
biologically, once a month,
Mm-hmm.
a woman will have some chemical things that happen to her that even the majority of women that you talk to, well, I'm struggling now because I'm chemically things are happening,
Right.
right? There are chemical things that happen to a man also because we have testosterone.
Right.
And those chemical things are influencing the way that we show up and that we perform every single day.
Right.
But in this space of manhood, what manhood really is in being dedicated to being of service, I have to provide stability mentally, emotionally, and spiritually to be that provider and the protector of my family's safety. So those are the clear-cut roles that we now have to put into play.
Yeah. And I would even say this, especially since we're talking about the HueMan podcast and we're looking at particularly Men of RQ. One of the things that we have to learn to navigate very well is management, provision, and stability of ourselves first. We have to look at our mental stability. We have to look at our mental provision. We have to look at our emotional stability. We have to look at all of these roles first internally. We first got to look internally and say, I have to become better at managing, like we just said, managing my emotions. I can't react off of everything that happens around me.
Yes.
It could literally cost me my life being Black.
Yep.
You know what I mean? If I walk out in this world and I decide I just want to pop off and I don't have control over my emotions or my reactions to things, then guess what? I could literally lose my life.
We've seen it.
It happened, and unfortunately, it happens way more to us than anybody.
Yep.
So we have to look at that. We have to look at how we respond to certain things that trigger us, and look at whether it be, again, words. It could be a woman yelling in our face. It could be another man yelling at us. It could be dealing with a cop. It could be dealing with a boss. It could be, all of these things that we have to deal with. If we don't learn how to first provide stability for ourselves and safety for ourselves, we can't expect to be the leaders that show up for anyone else in our society, in our families, for the women in our lives. We can't be that until we first learn how to do it within ourselves. And so I think one of the keys that I hope everyone starts to look at, because it's very simple, it's very easy for us to spend our time talking about all the things that we need to do and should do, but not necessarily knowing how to do it. And for me, that was the beginning of my journey into understanding my manhood. Was I first got to check me. Let me get into a position where let me get into a space where I say, okay, let me look at my childhood traumas. Let me look at those things that trigger me. Let me look at those moments in life where I didn't show up. Let me look at all of these and really start to unpack why it even happened, and what it is that I needed to do to make sure that never happened again. And it's taken time. You know what I mean? We're all a work in progress, but it's like, let me start to say, okay, well, if I'm wanting to make sure that I'm recognized and respected for my stability and my provision, let me first prove it to myself. If I say that I'm going to show up for someone, which, we've showed up for each other all the time.
Yep.
I'm going to do it. If I can't show up, I'm going to say that I can't do it.
Yep.
And I'm going to make sure. And if I promised that I would do it and now I can't, I'm going to apologize, and I'm going to let you know why. I'm going to be accountable, and we're going to move on. These are all things that we have to do and practice on a daily basis.
And if one of us doesn't perform in the ways that you just mentioned, that the other one will say, yo, bro, you need to make an adjustment.
Yeah.
And I think you need to be conscious of the fact that you didn't show up the way you should show up.
Right. And so I think that adds to another key tool that I think is necessary for our development is having accountability partners.
Yep.
You and I do this with each other all the time. And I'm just thinking about a scenario of something that happened with us recently. And it wasn't anything that even bothered you, but it bothered me. And I called and I apologized for something that had bothered me. And I was like, I want to make sure that we're clear and everything's okay. And it wasn't even a big deal to you.
And I was like,
yeah,
I'm good.
Right. And you were, but even in that, it wasn't just about that situation.
Yeah.
It was about the practice of making sure that
Absolutely.
when those times, if I ever feel like the spirit in me is triggered by something, I need to make sure that I address it.
Definite.
In any scenario in my life, if it happened, if those times where I feel like I didn't show up as my best self, I want to make sure I identify it I want to be my first accountability to myself.
Yep.
And then I'm going to have an accountability partner that actually sees those moments where I actually act out and where, again, kind of catches my blind spots.
Yep.
Or those moments where I don't show up. Make yourself accountable. And if you have to look for a big brother, a mentor, father figure, whatever it is that's necessary, try to put yourself in a position where that happens so that you can, again, develop that character in you, that integrity, so that the way you show up for anything is how you start to do everything.
Yeah. It's funny. you mentioning that particular incident, because even though I was good with what you were talking about, I remember getting off the phone and going, that's why this is my man. Like, that's why I messes with this dude. That's why I rock with this cat, because like me, always, look, I very rarely speak about anything that I don't know about. So when I do speak, I'm pretty educated about whatever it is that we're talking about or whatever it is that we're doing, but I'm always willing to be wrong.
Right.
And if there's something in me where I search it out and I don't feel good about it, I got to go to my brother and say, hey, man, I apologize. So when you came to me, your level of manhood had leveled up for me. And I mean, you already, so I'm not sure how much higher we could go with that. But I was just like, wow. My bro really like went to a whole, and that for me was manhood and masculinity at the same time. Because remember, masculinity is also about strength.
Right.
The strength to be able to be humble enough to say, hey, bro, you didn't even bring it to my attention. I'm bringing it to your attention.
Right.
Because I examined it and I wasn't good with it.
Right. Which is really vulnerability.
Totally.
That's what vulnerability really is about.
Which ironically, at the same time, is the strength to be vulnerable.
There you go. And that's just a different type of strength, you know. And it's something I've had to practice, because, you know, there have been times in the past where you could look at things that you've done, and I'll examine things that I've done. I'll be like, you know what I mean? My first reaction is, oh, whatever, you know what I mean? Just blow it off. But then you start to realize again that your actions do have a reaction, and they can affect people and how they see you. And especially because we don't have a history of being great communicators with each other. And I'm talking about men to men. We don't really talk to each other often enough about the things that we really go through, or how we really feel about things, or our vulnerabilities. We don't have practical daily things that we can do to help in our development. And to me, that was a big one. Like, okay, let me make sure I'm accountable to myself. Let me make sure I have an accountability partner. Now, if I'm going to have an accountability partner, that also means there's a certain level of trust, and there's a certain level of vulnerability that comes along with that. So making sure that I have someone that I feel comfortable in confiding in, that I know is not going to judge me, and that is going to help me in my development. And I think if we do that, it makes it so much easier to show up in other areas of our life. You may not necessarily be where you want to be yet, but you can get there with some practical application, with some practical understanding of how you can first become accountable to yourself, and be accountable to your partners, and be accountable to those around you, so that you can show up and be your best self in all aspects of life.
You know, talking about masculinity versus manhood, manhood versus masculinity, I think we've firmly established that the kind of strength that it takes in order for you to be vulnerable enough, open enough to be your best self, to acknowledge when you aren't your best, that is a masculine trait. And that you actually are, in the pursuit of manhood, that you are being masculine by showing strength to be open about how you perform, whether you are lacking in performance or you're performing above the bar that's being set. Tools, anything used as a means of accomplishing a task or a purpose. So tool number one, masculinity is also absolutely necessary in certain key areas of manhood.
Yeah, and I would say masculinity is definitely a necessary attribute for manhood. But you also have to make sure that you have wisdom on knowing when to apply that masculinity. Because masculinity without proper context is a weapon. So use it wisely.
Ask yourself, am I mistaking my masculinity for manhood? So walk with those so you can walk better.
There it is.
There you have it. Another episode down. Thank you guys for joining us for HueMan Podcast. I'm Dondre Whitfield.
I'm Antonio Dixon.
And we'll see you on the next one.
Peace.
'Cause we all one HueMan.